Sometime around the year 1132, in a convent in northern France, a woman wrote a letter to a man she had not seen in 15 years. She told him, in plain Latin, that God knew she had never sought anything in him except himself. She wanted simply him, nothing of his. The world had spent 2 decades trying to keep them apart and had largely succeeded. The letter survived anyway. Today, we follow 4 couples across 9 centuries and 4 continents who paid in their bodies, their thrones, their lives, or their solitude for refusing to listen when the world told them not to. Risto here, history buff, not historian. English isn't my first language, that's kind of the point. Learn a little, laugh a little, that's the deal. Human nature doesn't change, and neither does the plot. History rhymes and keeps the receipts. I mean, somebody always writes it down. A French philosopher and his teenage student separated by a knife in the night. A Chinese consort strangled with a silk cord on her own emperor's order. A Galician noblewoman murdered by her father-in-law the king and brought back, years later, to a throne she would never sit on. And an American couple arrested in their bed at 2 in the morning, 5 weeks after their wedding, for the felony of being married to each other. Let's start in Paris, around 1115. The man's name was Peter Abelard. At 36, he was already the most famous teacher of philosophy in Europe. Students came from England, Germany, and Italy to hear him lecture at the Cathedral School of Notre Dame. Sharp, vain, eloquent, and, by his own later admission, increasingly bored with celibacy. The woman's name was Eloise, probably around 16. She lived in the precinct of Notre Dame with her uncle, a cathedral canon named Fulbert. Already famous in Paris in a smaller circle for something almost unheard of for a girl in the 12th century. She had been thoroughly educated. She knew Latin, Greek, some Hebrew, and a great deal of classical philosophy. Fulbert was proud of her. He wanted the best tutor for her. He took in a paying boarder who happened to be the most famous teacher in Christendom and instructed him to continue Eloise's education. Abelard, in his own words, set out to seduce her from the moment he moved into the house. He was 36, she was probably around 16, she was his pupil, and he was a cleric. None of this was, by the standards of the time, an excusable situation. They became lovers within weeks. She became pregnant. Abelard sent her, in secret, to his sister in Brittany, where she gave birth to a son. They named the boy Astrolabe, after the astronomical instrument, because Eloise, even in the disaster, was still a scholar. When Fulbert found out what had happened, he was, understandably, furious. Abelard, to appease him, proposed a solution. He would marry Eloise, but the marriage had to remain secret because his advancement within the church depended heavily on appearing celibate. Eloise opposed the plan. She argued, in letters that have survived, that she did not want him to ruin his career for her. She would rather be his lover, his concubine, his anything, than the wife who destroyed his career as a theologian. She lost the argument. They married in Paris in secret. The secret did not hold. Fulbert began to spread the news, partly out of pride, partly out of revenge. To silence the rumor, Abelard moved Eloise to the convent of Argenteuil, outside Paris. Fulbert concluded that Abelard was trying to be rid of her by hiding her in a nunnery. He decided to take revenge. One night, in 1117 or 1118, Fulbert and several armed men paid a servant to let them into Abelard's bedroom while he slept. They held him down and they castrated him. Abelard never recovered, professionally or personally. He became a monk at Saint-Denis. Eloise, on his instructions, took religious vows at Argenteuil. She was about 17. Astrolabe was given to Abelard's sister to raise. In 1132, 15 years after the castration, Abelard wrote a long autobiographical letter to an unnamed friend describing his misfortunes. The letter circulated. A copy reached Eloise, who was now the abbess of a respected convent called the Paraclete, which Abelard himself had founded. She wrote back. What followed is one of the most extraordinary correspondences in European literature. Eloise, at 32, told Abelard that she had spent 15 years performing piety she did not feel, ruling a convent in his name, reading liturgy with her mouth while remembering their nights together. God knows, she wrote, that I never sought anything in you except yourself. I wanted simply you, nothing of yours. She told him that even at Mass, in the moment of the elevation of the host, her mind drifted back to him. She wrote, in the same letters, some of the most intellectually rigorous critiques of monastic life ever produced by a medieval woman. Abelard's replies were colder. He had, by this stage, accepted the castration as just punishment for his sin and tried to redirect Eloise towards spiritual love. Whether she ever accepted his theology is not clear from her letters. What is clear is that she went on running the Paraclete with extraordinary skill until her death in 1163 or 1164, achieving a level of ecclesiastical authority almost without precedent for a woman of her century. Abelard died in 1142. Eloise outlived him by about 21 years. According to her instructions, she was buried at the Paraclete in the same tomb as Abelard. The two bodies were transferred together to the Père-Lachaise cemetery in Paris in 1817. They are still there. People still leave letters on the tomb. We jump forward 600 years and a continent east to the Tang dynasty court in Chang'an in the year 740. The emperor was Xuanzong. At 55, he had been on the throne for almost 3 decades. In his early years, one of the great emperors of Chinese history, by 740, he was beginning to lose interest in administration. The woman was Yang Yuhuan. At 21, she was already married to one of Xuanzong's own sons. The emperor saw her at a family ceremony. He was, in the diplomatic phrasing of the Chinese chronicles, immediately taken with her. Within a year, she had been quietly removed from her marriage to the prince, sent to live for a few years in a Taoist nunnery, a customary device to dissolve a marriage discreetly, and in 745, at the age of 26, she was installed in the imperial palace as Gui Fei, the highest rank a consort could hold below empress. She had no political ambition that the sources record. She was, by all accounts, intelligent and accomplished as both musician and dancer. She was also fond of lychee fruit, so much so that the emperor had it brought by relay riders from Lingnan, 2,000 kilometers south, so it could arrive fresh. The Tang dynasty's later historians, looking for someone to blame for the catastrophe that followed, would call her the most beautiful woman in Chinese history. The honor was less than she deserved. Beauty was not what destroyed her. What destroyed her was politics. Once she was installed, her relatives moved into the major offices of the empire. Her cousin, Yang Guozhong, became chancellor and quickly made an enemy of the empire's most powerful general, An Lushan. In December 755, An Lushan revolted. By June 756, his armies were approaching Chang'an. On the night of the 13th of June, Xuanzong and his court fled the capital under cover of darkness, heading west towards the safety of Sichuan. The imperial guard escorted them, but the guard was furious. They blamed the Yang family for everything, for An Lushan's rebellion, for the loss of the capital, for the hunger and exhaustion of the march. On the second day of the flight, at a postal station called Marwei, about 100 kilometers west of Chang'an, the guard mutinied. They killed Yang Guozhong. Then they refused to march further until the emperor put Yang Yuhuan to death. Xuanzong tried to refuse. The army would not move. Whether she loved him in return is a question Chinese chroniclers have debated for 12 centuries. The conventional answer, from what survives of their correspondence, and from the fact that she had chosen to follow him into flight rather than remain safely behind, is yes. But by the time he had taken her from his own son's marriage at 21, the question of whether she could have said no had largely become academic. In the end, he sent his trusted eunuch, Gao Lishi, to handle it. Yang Yuhuan was led to a small Buddhist shrine beside the road at Marwei. She was 37 years old. Gao Lishi strangled her with a silk cord. Her body was wrapped in a purple blanket and buried in a shallow grave by the roadside. The army marched on. Xuanzong rode west. Within a year, the rebellion had been broken. Xuanzong's son, Suzong, had taken the throne. The old emperor returned to Chang'an as a retired father, broken, in his early 70s. According to one account that has survived, he sent eunuchs secretly to Marwei to recover Yang Yuhuan's body for a proper burial. They found that the body had decomposed in the months of rough soil. The sachet of fragrance she had been wearing at her death, however, was still intact. They brought the sachet back to the emperor. He held it in his hands and wept. He commissioned a painter to make a portrait of her, which he kept in a private palace and visited regularly until his death in 762. The Tang poet Bai Juyi, writing in 806, 50 years after the events, composed a poem called The Song of Everlasting Regret. It is still, today, one of the most famous poems in the Chinese language. It is what most Chinese people remember about Yang Yuhuan and Xuanzong. Not the politics, not the rebellion, not the strangling, but the sachet of fragrance and the old emperor weeping over it. "600 years later, on the Iberian Peninsula, in the Kingdom of Portugal, another court was tearing itself apart over a love affair. The man was Pedro, son and heir of King Afonso IV of Portugal. At 25, in 1340, his arranged marriage to Constanza of Castile took place. Constanza brought with her, as a lady-in-waiting, a Galician noblewoman of her own age, Inés de Castro. Inés was the illegitimate daughter of a powerful Galician lord, beautiful, intelligent, well-connected to the royal house of Castile. Pedro fell in love with her almost immediately. Constanza, his wife, was politely ignored. Constanza died in childbirth in 1345, leaving Pedro a widower with a young son. Pedro made no secret of his relief. He set up house openly with Inés. They had 4 children. They lived for almost a decade as a quiet shadow court. The prince, his Galician mistress, and their children, while the legitimate court of Afonso IV grew increasingly anxious about what this arrangement was doing to the kingdom. 2 concerns dominated. Inés's brothers had become Pedro's closest political advisors, and their Castilian connections worried a Portuguese nobility afraid of being absorbed into a larger Iberian crown. And Pedro was talking about Inés's illegitimate children increasingly as if they were not illegitimate at all, which threatened the succession. In 1354, Pedro went further. He publicly declared himself a pretender to the throne of Castile on a claim derived from Inés's family connections. This was, for Afonso IV, the breaking point. The king consulted his 3 closest advisors. They told him that as long as Inés lived, Pedro would be Galician. The king made the decision. On the 7th of January 1355, in the palace of Santa Clara at Coimbra, 3 men appointed by the king, Pero Coelho, Álvaro Gonçalves, and Diogo López Pacheco arrived with armed soldiers. Pedro was away. Inés was in the palace garden near a fountain with her children. They took her aside from the children and they killed her. The sources disagree on the exact method. Some say stabbed, some say beheaded. The children were left untouched. When Pedro learned what had happened, he raised an army and declared civil war against his father. He was defeated. Afonso died of natural causes 2 years later in 1357. Pedro became king of Portugal. 2 of the 3 assassins, Coelho and Gonçalves, were captured. The third, Pacheco, escaped to France. Pedro had Coelho and Gonçalves brought to him at Santarém. He had their hearts cut out in his presence, one from the front, one from the back. He is said to have eaten dinner while watching. That, however, was not enough. In 1360, Pedro made a formal public declaration. He claimed that he had married Inés de Castro in secret in the chapel of Bragança in 1354, before her murder. There were no witnesses other than himself, and the priest he named had since died. His word was the only proof. But under his declaration, Inés had not been his mistress at the time of her death. She had been his queen. In 1361, 6 years after her murder, he had her body exhumed from the convent of Santa Clara at Coimbra, where she had been buried in a simple tomb, and transferred in a solemn royal cortege with horsemen, candles, and chanting clergy to the abbey church of Alcobaça. There, he had her placed in a new sarcophagus of carved white limestone, with her image sculpted on the lid wearing the crown of Portugal. He had a second sarcophagus made, identical for himself. He placed it directly opposite hers, so that when both of them rose at the Last Judgment, the very first thing each of them would see would be the other. And, according to legend, during the ceremony of translation, he had her exhumed body dressed in royal robes, set upon a throne, and ordered the entire court to come forward, one by one, and kiss her hand. The tombs at Alcobaça are still there, still facing each other. The last story is the most recent. We jump from medieval Portugal to 20th century America. 6 centuries, 1 ocean, and a complete change of legal vocabulary. On the 2nd of June, 1958, a white construction worker from rural Virginia named Richard Loving drove with his pregnant fiancée, Mildred Jeter, to Washington, D.C., where they were married. Richard was 24, Mildred 18. He was white. She was of mixed Black and Native American ancestry. They had grown up together in Caroline County, Virginia. Their families had known each other for decades. The community where they lived, Central Point, was one of the few in segregation-era Virginia where Black, white, and Native American families lived and worked together. Marrying each other had never struck them as scandalous. They had simply needed to go to Washington, D.C. because in Virginia it was a felony. The Virginia statute they had circumvented was the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. It criminalized marriage between white and non-white Virginians, and also criminalized leaving the state to marry and returning afterwards. The Lovings had broken the second provision the moment they crossed back into Virginia. 5 weeks later, on the 11th of July 1958, at about 2 o'clock in the morning, the Caroline County Sheriff, Garnet Brooks, and 2 deputies entered the Lovings' bedroom while they slept, woke them with a flashlight, and arrested them. They had received an anonymous tip. When Richard pointed to their framed marriage certificate hanging on the bedroom wall as proof that they were married, the sheriff confiscated it as evidence. They pleaded guilty in January 1959. The judge, Leon Basile, gave them a choice: serve 1 year in prison or leave Virginia for 25 years and never return together. They left. They moved to Washington, D.C. They missed their families. After 5 years of exile, in 1963, Mildred wrote to the United States Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, asking whether he could help. He referred her to the American Civil Liberties Union. 2 young ACLU lawyers, Bernard Cohen and Philip Hirschkopf, took the case and argued it slowly through the Virginia courts. The case reached the United States Supreme Court on the 10th of April, 1967. Bernard Cohen told the court what Richard had asked him to say, which Richard had said as plainly as he ever said anything in his life. "Tell the court I love my wife," Richard had said, "and it is just unfair that I can't live with her in Virginia." On the 12th of June, 1967, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in Loving v. Virginia that the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 was unconstitutional. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote that the freedom to marry was one of the vital personal rights essential to the orderly pursuit of happiness. With one decision, the court struck down anti-miscegenation laws still in force in 16 American states. The Lovings went home. Richard built them a small cinder-block house in Central Point. They had 3 children. They raised them in Caroline County, where their parents had been arrested 9 years earlier for sleeping next to each other. On the night of the 20th of June, 1975, 8 years and 8 days after the Supreme Court's decision, the Lovings were driving home from a visit with friends on a back road in Caroline County. A drunk driver named Wendell Brown ran a stop sign and crashed into the side of their car. Richard was killed instantly by a piece of windshield to the head. He was 41. Mildred was in the passenger seat. She survived, but she lost her right eye. She lived for another 33 years. She never remarried. She remained in the cinder-block house in Central Point. She raised the children alone. She gave 1 or 2 interviews a decade when journalists came to find her. She kept her married name, which was Loving. She died in 2008, at the age of 68, of pneumonia. She is buried next to Richard in the same cemetery in Caroline County, Virginia, the state that had once told them that what they had was a felony. In the year 1132, Eloise wrote that she had never sought anything in Abelard except himself. Long before that, in the 1st century before Christ, the Roman poet Virgil had written, "Amor vincit omnia," love conquers all. By the time Yang Yuhuan was strangled by silk cord at Marway, by the time Inez de Castro was killed beside a fountain in Coimbra, by the time the Loving versus Virginia decision was read aloud in the Supreme Court of the United States, the saying had been tested across continents and centuries. It was not always quite true. Love did not always conquer. Sometimes love was strangled. Sometimes love was beheaded. Sometimes love was hit by a drunk driver 8 years after winning at the Supreme Court. But love, in each of these cases, did outlast what was done to it. Eloise and Abelard rest in the same tomb at Père Lachaise. Inez and Pedro lie in 2 identical sarcophagi at Alcobaça, facing each other so that they will see each other first at the Last Judgment. Mildred is buried beside Richard in a county that once put them in handcuffs for sharing a bed. Yang Yuhuan and Xuanzong are the exception, separated in death as they had been at the end, but the poem written about them 50 years later is still recited today, 12 centuries on. Each of these couples broke a rule that their society had made about who was allowed to love whom. Each of them paid for it, in different currencies. Not one of them lived to see how the story would end. They did it anyway. I'm Risto. Thanks for listening. See you next time. By the way, if you enjoyed this, the easiest way to support the show is to subscribe. That way, you won't miss the next one.